The memory of covering my first crime story 40 years ago has not faded with time. It was a cold afternoon on a bleak, windswept mountain in Leitrim in mid-December 1984. I was standing frozen to the spot, arms in the air, staring down the two long, shiny barrels of the old shotgun, pointing straight at me from a few feet away. My startled gaze met the owner's razor-sharp eyes as they peered unblinking between the two silver hammers at the operational end of the ancient weapon. I shot black and tans with this, and I'll do the same to you, you tinker. The hard edge of the pensioner's voice left no doubt that he and his trusted gun had indeed dispatched a few of the fated British paramilitaries over 60 years earlier. The situation wasn't helped by the fact that the stranger who called to his door was a dishevelled-looking 19-year-old in faded jeans and an old combat jacket. I had no doubt that he could do it again. The veteran of the War of Independence assured me the weapon was loaded. I believed every syllable he uttered as he sat in a chair facing the door in the modest, whitewashed cottage on Schleven, the mountain of iron, in whose shadow I'd grown up.
And that is the voice of Paul Williams, who's with me now. Paul, good morning. Well read.
Good morning, Matt. You threw me in at the deep end there. I didn't expect to be asked
Now, that is from the prologue to your new book, which is called Crooks, the Stories Behind the Headlines. It's a very interesting book because it brings us back to the very beginning, how a young fella, dishevelled in jeans and an old anorak, ends up being a crime reporter.
Straight out of Rap Mines.
It wasn't what you wanted to do. A war correspondent, I think, was what you fancied.
Yeah, I had sort of like I was a bit wild as a young lad. Some people say I probably haven't lost that, but what I had, I knew I wanted to be a journalist. When I was in 3 secondary schools, and the last secondary school, I had a brilliant teacher called Eamon Daly, and I got settled down, and I got my education, did the Leaving Cert, but I wanted to become a journalist, completely got set on that. But I wanted adventure and a bit of crack, and I wanted to be a war correspondent, and that's where it started.
Yeah, now you went to Rathmines for a period, for a period to get your journalistic spurs. What happened there?
Well, I spent a year there because it was a 2-year course at the time, and then I got offered a job halfway through by my local newspaper. I did my work experience in the Longford News, with your old friend Derek Cobb.
Derek Cobb, remember
him well. Legend. And then the Leitrim Reserver offered me a job, and I was advised by David Rice, my course supervisor, to take the job because, remember, these are the bleak 1980s, and I took the job. I didn't finish the college course, and some people said I never looked back.
Okay, now that encounter with the man with the shotgun was a first encounter with firearm, not your last encounter by any means, but going from a newspaper which didn't have that much adventure in the Leitrim Observer to being a crime journalist for the Sunday World and the Independent, how did that transition happen?
Well, I worked in the Leitrim Reserve for 6 months, and then Derek Cobb came back to me. He had a full-time job in the Longford News, and the Longford News was a very dynamic newspaper.
It was a colour newspaper at the time when everything was black and white.
Cobb was a legend in the business and a pioneer, and the Longford News was essentially the Sunday World, bright, breezy tabloid broadsheet of the rural of provincial newspapers, and it was very exciting. I ended up working with John Donlan, who was my lifelong friend. He was my news editor there. He actually trained my Mrs. Anne. He then became my news editor in the Sunday World. He lives around the corner from me. He's been like my daddy all these years, and I had a wonderful time there. And then in 1986, the Sunday World advertised for 2 junior reporters, and to my surprise, I applied for the job, and everybody was interviewed and went back 2 or 3 times, and I was selected, and I had the great honour of joining the Sunday World in 1987 along with Kathy Kelly, who I keep saying to her, Kathy, where did it all go wrong for me, baby? And that was the start of it. And ironically, of course, when I joined the Sunday World, another luminary in the gangland whose career I've charted all the way through since, the Monk, he had hit the big time because literally about a week before I joined the Sunday World, he pulled off the biggest cash robbery in the history of the state at the time at Marino Mart. So, he's nearly the same age as myself. So
you find him quite a fascinating figure, even though he has done terrible things.
Yeah, he is a fascinating figure. And I sort of say that in the book, because I trying to get cover as many bases as I could. He is a fearsome character, and anyone that gets embroiled with him from the legitimate world can be poisoned, and they can be very toxic, these people. But at the same time, I still, and I could do it in this because this is a personal book, that I could say, I actually like the guy to an extent, and I call him as the least worst of them all. And he certainly was a guy with ethics, and he was certainly a guy who still displayed, and still does display, I think, the the principles of the ordinary, decent criminal.
If we look to the genesis of many of the stories that you're talking about, I mean, you have to look to Northern Ireland and firearms as being contributing to, like, once firearms become common currency, the world becomes a much more dangerous place. And the second thing is the arrival of heroin on the streets of Dublin, and ultimately then cocaine and other bad stuff.
Well, the people who are, and this is like, I've written histories of organised crime in Ireland and all of that before, and it is very, like, the role of the provisional IRA, they hate this, the provost, they hate being reminded of this, but they are the harbingers. They were the people who basically introduced the gun to Irish streets in 1970, but they also are the people who educated and showed the way to a whole new generation of corner boys and young thugs who didn't really have much else to be doing. In other words, they launched organised crime in this country, and that is their legacy. Because remember, they were trying at the time politically to undermine the stability of the state here and undermine the Irish Republic for their own means. And on the back of that, in the shadow of the gunmen, you had, like the John Gilligans, George Mitchell, the Hutches, the older Hutch brothers, all these lads, all the infamous gangsters. They started, a lot of them had been disenfranchised. A lot of them had been dehumanized by the appalling system, the gulag system we call the industrial and reformatory schools. And they were just waiting for their chance, and the Duns particularly. And they went out and they started robbing. And one of the things they used to do, and I remember interviewing guys through the decades about this, they started practicing Nordy accents, so that when they go in, it was for the cause. And so everyone said, oh, it was another IRA robbery. So in fairness, they used the IRA to the best of their ability.
Now, you put yourself in harm's way because this became quite a dangerous pursuit to be a journalist. And we know poor Veronica Guerin paid for her journalistic
and
curiosity
as well.
with her life, and then Martin O'Hagan. How close did you come to...
Well, first of all, I didn't plan on any of that. Like, it just happened to, it incrementally you slide into this different dark and demented world, I call it. I came very, very, very close a number of times, particularly in 96. I also came very, very close in 2003. And I've said in the book, there's a number of things. The reason I'm here is, one, probably God and good luck, but primarily on Garda Síochána, because they did so much through the years behind the scenes.
I remember you coming into the Late Late Show to talk to me, and in hospitality, there was your armed guard protector.
I had bodyguards full time for well over two years, and then as part, I was put in the equivalent of a witness protection program where the family were guarded as well. So we had 24/7, 365 at the house. We had guards at a cabin, and they were part of our lives. They literally became part of our lives, and it was every day when you went out. When I went out my front door, I was always reminded of the crap I got myself into and the trouble I got myself into.
And you're asking yourself, why am I doing this to the family?
Well, you see, that's one of the issues that you keep getting asked all the time. And I do talks, and I was asked to do this book. As this could be an idea. And as I say, I never intended any of that to happen, but it just happened, gradually, because I got very, very passionate about what I was doing. Because remember, after Veronica was murdered, and then Marty was murdered, and I was meeting all through that time, and the people who moved me and moulded me most were the people I met who were being bullied and terrorised and whose loved ones were murdered. And they're among my dearest friends, some of them, because of the fact that their lives were blighted. And as Joe Duffy said one time, they invested by these monsters. And, the thing with the kids and I also say as well, like my Mrs. Anne, you have met her many times, and she was ahead of me in journalism, and she was an award-winning journalist herself. But I always admired her. We've been together since I was 20, and she, when she was a young, very, very young reporter, worked for Lucius Farrell in the Longford Leader, and Longford was a real bastion of good journalism, like Liam Collins, Eugene Master, and all these guys' names of people that came out of Longford. And when she was young, like Lucius Farrell was a rebel, and he said she was always a feminist. So I've lived in the clutches of feminism all my life. And I very rarely only get macho when I get in the pub. But anyway, And she wrote a piece that women have a right to choice. Imagine this now in the late 70s, like in national journalism.
And published by that paper.
Yeah, but it was heretical for anyone to be doing. But to do it, but you know what the bastards did? And I only found this recently. A couple of years ago, I was rooting out in the attic, and I found this front page from the Irish Catholic newspaper, The Angelus or something. And the headline was "No, Anne Sweeney." They put her on the front page of their newspaper. And imagine how demonised. She was only a young girl. How she was basically the ultimate harlot. But what they did as well, her mother's, she's from Ballinamore like me, and her mother was a beautiful, lovely, 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 inoffensive, humble lady. And this boot boy from the Catholic Church went down to sat down with her and said, "What are you going to do with this tramp of a daughter of yours?" And she was traumatised by it. Can you imagine the power of them? So I tell that story, and she gets annoyed at me for telling the story in this book, because I was trying to explain, well, hang on a minute, this is why I was interested. That's about what journalism is about. You stand up to these people. But she had more of an experience of intimidation than I could ever have, because this was institutionalised intimidation, and she was being othered, and she was being pushed to the side and demonised. And so I always use that as an excuse.
Now, I want to play a clip from Liveline, and you might explain after we play it, just to know that the people on the line are actually in jail.
Yeah.
So have a listen to this.
John Daly's on the line. John, good afternoon to you.
How's it going? All right?
Yeah, you're in Portlaoise prison at the
I'm in
moment.
Portlaoise, yeah. There's only one place it can be. Paul Williams knows that very well.
Okay, take your time now, John.
Okay, I will do. How's it going, Alan? All right?
Not too bad. Yourself?
Yeah, pops. Thanks for the Coast Guard while you're away.
Oh, bother.
Now, Mr. Williams, how many thousand people did you say read your newspaper every Sunday?
Almost 1 million.
All a million. Did you know how much lies you tell every week? Did you know that I sent a registered posted letter today with an article of that newspaper you just wrote, saying that I carried out armed robberies when I get out on my review?
But you're in
2003, that I did not get arrested for any armed robberies.
You're in prison serving how many years?
Doesn't matter how many years I'm serving.
Actually, where do you get the mobile phone to ring out?
Who told you I had a chat again?
Memories.
Yeah, now the extraordinary thing is that on foot of that conversation, of course, using an illicit mobile phone in prison, it meant that the whole place was turned upside down on foot of that call.
It was an extraordinary moment. Joe Duffy had, I was on to arguing about Sinn Féin and their juxtaposition to organised crime. And since we look at Jonathan Dowd, what was that about? And then next suddenly, because like, the person I was talking about was a very decent man, but it was very obvious that I pissed Sinn Féin off. So Alan Fatpuss Bradley, a notorious gangster from Finglas, who I've been writing about, rang in, and he was all brave. And I said to him, "Have you any issue with the IRA or Sinn Féin?" And he said, "No, I don't. I hope they don't have any issue with me. No, let me tell you." And he was giving me socks. And then suddenly I remember, Joe says that line, "John Daly, John Daly's here." And then Joe's going, "Now hang on, John, calm down, John." And he was going ballistic. And when I said to him, "Where'd you get the phone?" At the end of that interview, it ends with, "I have to go now. You start wars. I have to go now. I have to go," because the prisoners were piling into the cell to take the phone. Now, he was very close to John Gilligan and the boys, and they were all running their business from there. And the story that can now be told all these years later is that the guards knew they had phones, a lot of them. They were bugging the phones. And as a result of it, they were cleaning up with drug busts, because all the drugs were being organised from Portlaoise. And I had written this, and of course, I had a history of conflict with our great Minister for Justice at the time, Michael McDowell, and I had been making this point. He said, "This is all nonsense." And I said to Joe afterwards that was amazing radio at the time. And Joe famously said at the end of it to the listener, he says, "Let that invest, INFEST, its way into your brain in an election year, in an election cycle." And then there was a massive row, because I said, "Look, Joe, this is what we've been talking about all the time. This is the kind of nonsense that's going on." And then Michael McDowell went crazy, and then Joe was famously, a television programme made about it, Joe was famously told by the DG of RT, such windbags really, and they said, "You are going to have Michael McDowell on the show, unfettered, no communication with the public, on Liveline, which is the People's programme, for a full 15-20 minutes, and he's going to say what he wants." And Joe, you could hear it in his voice, he sat back and said, "All right, Minister, you want to talk to us? There you go." Can you remember that? It was astonishing stuff. And I thought, if I ever heard Joe Duffy being angry, it was that day.
Now, you mentioned some of the people by name, like the monk and the general and so on. Were you the person who came up with and Fatpuss? Were you the person who came up with the nicknames?
I came up with a lot of nicknames, but
you were criticised maybe for for giving them,
Glamorising,
glamorizing, giving them the tough names. And although Fat Puss doesn't sound too tough, but there you go.
But like Brian Meehan, I put the nickname on him, the tosser. It was too early in the morning to explain that to your listeners. That's why we call him that. But like the general had his nickname, the monk had his nickname. The monk's nickname didn't emerge from gangland until he did the next big robbery in 1995. The general was called the general by the villains because he was military planner. They called him MacArthur originally. But what we did after the general, I sort of developed a template in the Sunday World whereby we started investigating these guys. And for a time, I was banned from writing about the general. So I had a couple of years until Michael Brophy and Colin McGinty came in to liberate us in 1994, and the paper took on a whole new lease of life. But I began to compile intelligence on them, who they were, what they were. I had two lads work with me, Pádraig and Liam O'Connor, and I would send, listen lads, go out, let's go to funerals, let's go any place we knew they would gather. We would photograph them. We would identify the pictures. I would create a file on each guy and gradually build up intelligence on them. So we had information. So when it came to the time to expose them, 9 times out of 10, you didn't always have the shot that you needed to name them. So we started putting nicknames on the Sunday World. We became famous, and it was as well organised and planned as a Saturday afternoon. Colin McGinty come down twitching on his moustache and, Polly, what are we going to call this effer? We can't name him, so what are we going to call him? And the lawyer saying, no, you can't name him. Jerry Fanning was the time, and then Kieran Kelly, you can't name him. No. So we come up with something colourful. Like PJ Judge, we called him the Psycho, which was well entitled. And one of the lines, we used to always give hints as to who they were, because I remember in the front page piece I wrote about him, which nearly got me killed afterwards. But I said, this is the Psycho believes he's judge, jury, and executioner. And we put Fatso Mitchell, Georgie Mitchell was a great one, because Georgie Mitchell is now one of the biggest drug traffickers in the world. And I was the first one ever to write about George. And I met John Traynor, who was the consigliere to Martin Cahill and to John Gilligan, and I was in the drug business with him and changed the drug business. Very bright guy, but an extremely devious bastard. And he I said, he didn't like Mitchell. And they're always bitching about each other, stabbing each other in the back, the gangsters. They're worse than journalists. And he said, I said, well, I want a nickname for him, because we put nicknames on all these guys who can't name him. He says, well, what? Describe him to me. Well, he waddles. He's a big fat bee, and he waddles like a penguin. I goes to Colin McGinty. Got it, baby. Penguin. Gotham City. Now, as somebody said recently, our own great star, Mr. Farrell, he's actually playing the part of the Penguin now on TV. So, maybe we started something.